Imagine living in a quiet provincial city. Streets where children play, neighbors greet each other, and life seems ordinary. But beneath this calm surface, someone walks among them, unnoticed, unremarkable, and yet hiding something terrifying. This is the story of a man who carried a camera not to film family memories or landscapes, but to document something far darker. His recordings were not for art, not for history, but for his own private archive of horror. For years, nobody knew what he was doing. People passed him in shops, on buses, in stairwells. To the world, he was just another face in the crowd. But behind closed doors, he became something else entirely, an obsessive chronicler of his own cruelty. Early signs. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Russia was going through immense social change. Communities were stretched thin, law enforcement struggled with limited resources, and crime rates were rising. It was in this environment that the man found his cover. He was not remarkable in appearance. Average build, average job, nothing that would draw suspicion. But those who later studied him discovered an unusual obsession: cameras, tapes, and recording equipment. He spent countless hours collecting tools, preparing scenes, and watching footage, not of movies, but of his own actions. The obsession with recording. Most criminals act in the shadows and hope never to be discovered. This man was different. His crimes were not just about committing the act, they were about capturing it. The lens of his camera became part of his ritual. Experts who later analyzed his behavior said that the recording was not secondary, it was central. Without the tape, without the proof, the crime itself felt incomplete to him. He wanted to preserve the memory, to replay it, to build an archive that only he controlled. How he chose victims. The details of his targets remain painful to recount, but a pattern was clear. He looked for vulnerability, young people, isolated spaces, moments when no one else was watching. He knew how to appear friendly, how to lower defenses, how to make himself seem harmless. Witnesses later described him as quiet, polite even, someone who never raised suspicion. That was his camouflage. He didn't need force to approach at first, he needed trust. And once he had it, the trap was set. Inside the secret archive. When investigators finally uncovered his home, they found what can only be described as a personal museum of cruelty. Shelves lined with tapes, boxes carefully labeled, scenes recorded with disturbing attention to detail. It was not chaos, it was order, organized, methodical, deliberate. He was not a man acting on impulse, he was building a collection. The authorities who viewed the tapes later said that they were among the most disturbing pieces of evidence ever catalogued. They revealed not only his crimes, but his mindset. He wanted control. He wanted to replay the moments again and again. Why he was hard to catch. For years, he remained invisible. The city was full of bigger problems: corruption, street crime, economic collapse. In that environment, a quiet man with a camera simply didn't stand out. Some victims spoke up, but their voices were lost in the noise of a society in transition. Police departments lacked manpower. Families sometimes didn't believe what children said. All of this created the perfect storm, a predator who could continue unchecked right in the middle of everyday life. The turning point. What finally exposed him was not a single act, but the sheer scale of his obsession. His need to record grew so great that he could no longer hide it. People began to notice strange behavior. Whispers spread. Eventually, one brave individual reported him, and investigators decided to dig deeper. When the search warrant was executed, the discovery stunned even hardened detectives. They had expected perhaps a few tapes, maybe a sign of deviance. What they found instead was an archive stretching across years, possibly decades. The man was no longer just a suspect. He was undeniable proof of how far obsession can drive someone when it goes unchecked. By the time the arrest was made, the community was in shock. Neighbors could not believe it. They said things like, "He seemed normal. He lived among us. We never imagined." But behind that mask of normality was a man who had carefully crafted his own hidden world, one that existed on tape, preserved in boxes, waiting to be uncovered. This was not the end of his story. The arrest was only the beginning of a long and painful process. A courtroom battle, a sentence, and a legacy of fear that would outlast him.
Once Ryalkov was taken into custody, his trial quickly became one of the most shocking cases in Voronezh's modern history. Prosecutors brought forward not just witness testimonies, but the undeniable video evidence found in his home. The defense attempted to portray him as unstable, claiming that he suffered from deep psychological disorders and could not control his actions. But psychiatric experts countered this argument. They concluded that he fully understood the consequences of what he was doing. He planned his crimes step by step, prepared his equipment, and deliberately kept records. This was not the work of someone out of touch with reality. It was the work of a cold, organized offender. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. Families of victims attended, and every new piece of evidence felt like a dagger. Judges and jurors had to carefully balance how much of the tapes to show, since they were far too disturbing to play in full. In the end, the evidence spoke for itself. Ryalkov was found guilty of multiple counts of kidnapping, violent crimes, and murder. The verdict was life imprisonment. Life behind bars. Ryalkov was transferred to a high-security prison, one of the harshest environments in Russia. Life inside such colonies is brutal, and for someone convicted of crimes against children, survival is difficult. Inmates in Russian prisons often despise offenders of this type more than any others. Reports suggested that Ryalkov kept a low profile. He rarely spoke to other prisoners, avoided attention, and spent most of his time in isolation. Some accounts claim he was attacked more than once. Others indicate that prison authorities kept him under strict watch, not out of compassion, but because his case was so notorious. In this isolated world, far removed from the streets of Voronezh, the once predatory man lived a life of quiet survival, stripped of control, stripped of freedom. The fate of the tapes. One of the darkest questions that lingered after the trial was, what would happen to the recordings? Officially, all of Rylkoff's tapes were confiscated and placed into secure evidence storage. None of them were ever meant to be released to the public. But rumors began to spread in the years that followed. Some whispered that copies had leaked, that fragments of the footage circulated in hidden corners of the Internet. Although these claims remain difficult to verify, the very possibility has haunted investigators and victims' families. The idea that strangers might still view these recordings means that Rylkoff's crimes could never fully be buried in the past. A profile of obsession. Psychologists who studied Rylkoff described him as a rare and terrifying case. He was not simply someone who committed violent crimes. He elevated his acts by recording them, cataloging them, and creating a personal archive. His behavior revealed several disturbing traits: fixation on children. He consistently targeted very young victims. Compulsion to record. The camera was not optional, it was central to his ritual. Cold calculation. He prepared carefully, with patience and planning. Lack of remorse. Even when confronted, he admitted his interests without emotion. To criminologists, Rylkoff represented a dangerous new kind of predator, one who blurred the line between criminal reality and his own twisted form of filmmaking. Impact on society. The Rylkoff case left scars not just on his victims, but on the entire community. Parents across Voronezh grew fearful. Schools began warning children to stay away from strangers, reinforcing a sense of vigilance that had not been common before. The case also highlighted the weaknesses of the 1990s justice system. Russia at the time was undergoing major political and economic change, and police resources were stretched thin. Many crimes went unsolved, and predators like Rylkoff exploited this lack of order. For years after his arrest, his name carried weight as a symbol of danger. Families whispered about the man with the camera, and the fear lingered long after he was locked away. Comparison to other offenders. Russia has produced several infamous figures in its criminal history: Chikatilo, Popkov, Pichushkin. Their victim counts were higher, their names more widely known. But what set Rylkoff apart was his obsession with documentation. While other predators focused on numbers or notoriety, Rylkoff focused on preservation. He wanted his crimes to live beyond the moment, to be replayed endlessly. In that sense, his archive made him one of the most disturbing criminals in modern Russian history. Why his story still matters. Decades later, Rylkoff's story is still studied and retold for several reasons. 1. The recordings. The existence of the tapes makes his case uniquely haunting. 2. Survivor voices. Some of his victims lived, and their testimonies exposed the truth. 3. Unanswered questions. The full number of his victims remains unknown. 4. Cultural fear. He embodies the idea of the ordinary man who hides monstrous secrets. Lessons from the case. The story of Oleg Rylkoff teaches several painful but important lessons. It shows that predators often appear ordinary, blending into society unnoticed. It emphasizes the importance of listening to children when they speak up. In some cases, earlier reports of his behavior were ignored and lives were lost as a result. It also demonstrates that evil does not always end with a prison sentence. The digital shadow of his crimes, those recordings, continues to cast fear long after the man himself was locked away. Closing reflection. Oleg Ryalkov was not a monster in appearance. He did not look like a villain from a movie. He looked like anyone else walking down the street. But in secret, he was creating his own horrific films, using innocent lives as unwilling actors. His arrest ended his reign of terror, but the memory of what he did remains alive in the minds of survivors, investigators, and an entire community that will never forget. The most frightening criminals are not always the ones we expect. They can be quiet, invisible, hidden in plain sight. Oleg Ryalkov reminds us that evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and sometimes it films.